most people will go through, and it's a weird world of sleep, to be honest with you. It almost doesn't become a problem until the person thinks it's a problem. So lots of people can go undiagnosed for many, many years and be treated for some of the symptoms that they see of it. So we're talking high blood pressure, for instance, as I mentioned, stroke, cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, those sorts of things. They end up with lots of medications, but the underlying problem has never really been discussed. Sleep disorders, even as a general, or sleep complaints, if you like, we think that there's about 2 billion worldwide. And to put that into context, more people have a sleep problem than have an iPhone.
Welcome back to Plant Fueled. I'm your host, Callum Weir. Over a third of us struggle to fall asleep or wake up repeatedly during the nighttime. Sleep deprivation is more common than ever, with the average person getting around 6.5 hours of sleep per night. And it's not just about feeling groggy the next day. Chronic sleep issues are fueling a surge in life-threatening conditions, from cardiovascular disease and diabetes to severe mental health disorders, often going undiagnosed. One of the biggest culprits, sleep apnea, a condition becoming increasingly more prevalent in society, particularly among those experiencing menopause and perimenopause, where some of the worst sleep disruptors occur. With over 2 billion people worldwide struggling with poor sleep, it's clear that we're facing a global sleep crisis. But why? We often blame modern habits, endless scrolling on TikTok or late night Instagram doom scrolling, blue light exposure. But is this truly the root cause? Because even my own assumptions about the link between screen time and poor sleep didn't match up to the research. So what's really happening? To break it all down, I am joined by Josh Piper, a leading sleep clinician at ResMed's London Sleep Clinic. He's spent years studying the science of sleep and has an abundance of knowledge to help us understand the shocking rise of undiagnosed sleep disorders and their long-term health consequences, why sleep apnea is becoming more common, and how to identify those warning signs, the impact of hormonal changes for people with menopause and perimenopause, and the science of sleep regression, and how our sleep cycle is changing over time. We dive into exercise and lifestyle, and how those choices can improve sleep quality, the truth about screen time, social media and blue light, and sleep paralysis demons. What's really happening to our brain when they appear? Josh's insights go far beyond just get off your phone before you go to bed advice. This conversation is packed with cutting edge research, expert insights and actionable steps, helping you to take control of your sleep and ultimately your long-term health. But before we dive in, if you could do me one favour, only one favour, if you could give this podcast a like, follow, share, star rating, whatever the platform you choose allows you to do, it means the world of difference. It helps me bring the conversations that you've been asking for, the guests you want, and allows me to keep this running. That little gesture helps more than you could ever imagine. But that's enough from me. Here's Josh Piper. Let's dive in. Peace and plants. Josh, welcome.
Thank you very much.
I think before we dive into this topic, because it's something that is very beneficial these days, especially when it's, surrounding sleep, is coming from a sleep expert himself. How well did you sleep last night?
So there has been a slight change to my schedule at the moment, in as much as I mentioned just before we started that I'm sitting in a hotel at the moment in Edinburgh. But I must say I'm one of the reasonably lucky people that a change in environment doesn't affect me too much. So yeah, I slept well. Thanks very much.
I'm guessing as well that comes from obviously cultivating and compounding practices over time and implementing obviously that knowledge that you've learned over that time to kind of create those sleeping habits. So when you are in a new situation, you are in a hotel, you are abroad, you can kind of slip into that habit very easily.
Absolutely. It's essentially about creating cues, if you like, because your brain loves patterns. And so if you give it the pattern that tells it, okay, it's time to start winding down, it almost doesn't matter where you are, it'll recognize those patterns and go, okay, time to start doing certain things that's going to make sure that we think about sleep at least.
So is there skills and habits that you've had to implement over time? Because I'm guessing you weren't always a sleep expert. This is something that's come along in the last however many years. And I know, like, obviously, a lot of us when you were younger, I feel like we're probably around the same age. Is the fact that we don't have a lot of what's going on in the world now, like your TikTok, your phones, like you're scrolling. So it's still a very new subject. Although we've been sleeping for millions and millions of years, like I feel like it's still very overlooked. But I'm guessing there's definitely skills there that you've had to create to make a consistent habit.
Yeah, I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head, really, in what you said with regards to we've been doing it for a very, very long time. I'm going to butcher this particular quote, and I forget who says it, but essentially, if sleep wasn't needed, it's evolution's biggest mistake, because essentially it puts you in a very vulnerable position,
Mm.
which in the past, not particularly ideal in those scenarios. So yeah, certainly now that's obviously fine. You're enclosed in a room, but to be in that position, it must serve a vital function. So yeah, it's particularly nowadays. You're right in what you say is that people have kind of put it on the back burner a little bit. Things are improving, and people are starting to understand about it being a pillar of health, and it's having its PR day, if you like. But certainly, nutrition and fitness has already been out there. People are just starting to go, okay, maybe there are some practices that I need to put in place for this, yeah, real underpinning foundation of my health.
Yeah, because that's the thing. Like, I obviously myself work in human nutrition, so and it blows my mind that people that don't think about sleep as much. They feel about what they're putting in their body, like how they're going to exercise, their daily routines. But sleep doesn't always come into like the main factor of it. But also at the same time, we've got two ways of thinking, I guess, as well, which is kind of like either go get a good night's sleep, do 8-9 hours, whatever it is, or that rise and grind culture at the moment as well, which is kind of like we should wake up, we should
Yeah,
do some kind of like ice bath, we need to start running at 5 a.m. and no matter what that means, whether that's going to bed at like let's say 10 and waking up at 4, losing sleep, and then just kind of pushing through. And I think there's a there's a big shift in the way people look at sleep, and sometimes that's for the best, and sometimes more having a negative impact.
yeah, absolutely. Again, you've definitely done your reading, but but it's essentially, yeah, you're getting a lot of, particularly influencers. It tends to be that kind of area typically, and certainly sort of the wider media has for the longest time said, yeah, you need to be out working, grinding as you said, putting in those hours. What they don't take into account is if you haven't had a good night's sleep, well, your grind the next day isn't as good. So in actual fact, you end up losing a lot of your performance, and that can be cognitive, it can be physical, and the biggest one that people forget, of course, is emotional. And all of a sudden, we wonder why people have this level of presenteeism at work, with particularly the recent survey that ResMed did to show that most people out there have called in sick at least once in the year because of lack of sleep, and that alone. So yes, it's no surprise.
So World Sleep Day, that was last week. I
It
didn't
was,
realize that was a day. I didn't realize it was a day. To be fair, I don't realize a lot of these things are a day because there's days for everything these days. And I think actually looking back now, one of our first episodes on this podcast was about sleep. That was years ago, and obviously things have changed. Science has changed since then as well. And it hasn't really been touched on again since. I haven't really touched on it as much as I have like the human nutrition and of the body and exercise. Um, so it definitely was for me. It's definitely one of those foundational pillars to a healthier life, along with nutrition, exercise, hydration, sleep. But for the people that aren't familiar with who you are, who is Josh?
oh crikey, how long have you got? Um, but I'll be quite honest. Yeah, there's not necessarily a lot to it, if you like. I mean, my background, you kind of touched on it. I've been in sleep now for over a decade.
Hmm.
And that's been in both a private setting and with the NHS for a large proportion of it, working both with paediatrics and adults. And I've seen all of the weird and the wonderful. pretty much from, parasomnias, people waking up with night terrors and sprinting across the room, people whipping bed covers off of people because they think that their person next to them is on fire. Um,
Ooh.
yeah, and all the way through to your slightly more in the light at the moment, if you like, obstructive sleep apnea. Um, and what I must say is that throughout a decade of doing it, I've only become more interested in it. There's just every single day there's something new that you can find out about sleep. So for me, yeah, I just get more and more interested the whole time.
I didn't realize there was so many kind of conditions surrounding it. As you saying, people imagining people are on fire. And I know people have like sleep paralysis demons and all sorts, but
Oh yeah.
like you feel like for me that I would say that I'm a very good sleeper. I'm very much I hit the pillow and I'm done. That's me. Whereas there's a lot of people in my life with certain conditions where well, I'm not too sure if they're conditions at all. It's very much one of my close friends, very bad sleeper. We lived together, and no matter what time you went into his room during the night, he'd always be awake, and he'd have like 3 or 4 hours of sleep, and never felt rested. Because I feel like after how many years of 3 hours sleep, you are going to feel unrested, and like I wasn't too sure how he was able to actually function, and if he was functioning, not at a high level. However, I thought he was like an outlier, like somebody
Mhm.
that just kind of, may just be able to function well but have lack of sleep. However, I didn't realize that such a large percentage of people, especially in Britain, aren't getting like enough sleep or rest at all.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, your friend is at the extreme end of that spectrum. I must say, the problem that we've got is that as a population, as a species, to be quite honest with you, we are rubbish at knowing when we are chronically sleep deprived. We're really, really good at knowing when we've had one bad night. Everybody
Mm,
can tell you I had a rubbish night's sleep. I felt rubbish the next day. But if you take away small amounts of sleep, and there's been studies on this as well, small amounts of sleep over a long period of time, it's a little bit like boiling the frog in the water from cold to hot. You don't notice before it's too late. And for a lot of people, it's that underlying increase in various other comorbidities. So cardiovascular disease, stroke, cancer, you name it. Poor sleep in general increases your risk of all of that. So yeah, to see the numbers you mentioned there as Britain getting roughly 6.5 on average, we expect the averages be between 7 and 9. That's where most people's opportunity needs to be for sleep. Um, but as I kind of mentioned there, everyone thinks they're the outlier,
mm.
and most people will assume they can get by on 5, 6. Those people are few and far between.
I would say when I was younger, I didn't think I was the outlier. I used to work on party islands, so me living on
Oh,
3 hours sleep a night, full of alcohol and whatever else. I thought that I was an outlier. I was going to survive. I was probably the healthiest person doing this. However, like I feel like after like a year or so doing it, you're like, oh, this is really taking its toll on me now. But it's weird because there's a lot of people that say they can like just purely function on, as you said, 6 hours sleep. However, the recommended guidelines, I'm guessing throughout the world, not just Britain as well, is like, 8 or 9. You hear that everywhere. You hear that on podcasts. You hear that like from like, doctors, physicians, but people don't seem to want to listen to that anyway. So it's kind of like the less sleep, it's going to be fine. There's not going to be any real repercussion of that. Maybe I feel a bit tired on the day, and we'll just get on with life.
yeah, and don't get me wrong. I say on the occasional nights, it's really important not to be over anxious about individual nights. So we can, as I said, we can all have one bad night. And in actual fact, that lends itself to something called orthosomnia, which you may well have planned to talk about anyway. But essentially, this strive for perfect sleep. It's almost the opposite of what we're seeing, and that's part and parcel because of the gadgets that we see today as well. But yeah, in terms of the number of people that would get by on 6, 5, 4, they just really don't exist too much. And there's one family that I'm aware of in Italy that they've done studies on, that gets away, essentially, if you like, with 4 hours sleep. they're seeing no mal effects on their overall health outcomes. But yeah, for most people, and I'll be honest with you, the easiest way you can do this, so for the people listening, this is a really easy way to figure out your own sleep requirement. The next time you are away for a nice relaxing holiday, you don't have to wake up with alarms, nothing like that. You can just lay in bed. Great. Get yourself to bed at roughly the same time every single night. Don't set alarm, as I say. And the first 3 mornings, you will find that you start waking up quite weird times. They're all different. Some are earlier, some are later. After day 4, 5, 6, 7, what you'll find is you're actually waking up at a very, very similar time, kind of within 10 to 20 minutes. All you do at that point is you count back to your bedtime and you've found your rough sleep requirement. It's a really easy way of doing it.
That's really interesting, actually, because I've like, I don't think many people actually know that. Like, they're just kind of
No.
like, hey, we're just going to kind of wake up and just, see what happens on the day. So when it does come to sleeping, though, like these statistics of like, people not being able to sleep, is that people trying to fall asleep, or is this, wake up periods in time as well? Because I'm guessing there's a lot of waking up during the night, whether that's the toilet or to check the phone, or and I get when you have kids, that's a very different issue, and that's like a kind of gray area where you can't really avoid that. But like
Mhm.
the statistics that are like people are like not having enough sleep, is it very much trying to get to sleep, or is it kind of like waking up halfway through, or just multiple times?
So to be quite honest with you, it's a mix.
Okay.
So there will be people, we essentially refer to it as like a sleep onset issue. So the people that struggle to get to sleep, um, that's one sort of type of insomnia, if you like. And then you have a maintenance-based insomnia, which is where you're waking up in the night and struggling to get back to sleep. So that's one element of it. It could be, though, for instance, that they're waking up, and we mentioned it sort of shortly, because of obstructive sleep apnea. So our airways are closing, no air in, no air out. Your brain goes into a bit of an emergency, and it wants to wake you. That doesn't always happen. You don't always wake every time that occurs, but you might find that that's happening. And if it's fragmented enough, you're not diving down into those nice deep stages of sleep where we start producing things like antidiuretic hormones, which obviously stops us producing urine. So our bladder fills up through the night. At some point, that balloon's going to need to burst. So you're going to wake up and need to pop to the loo. And then, as I say, it all cascades off of that. People start giving those times that they're awake a function. And that's one of the worst things you can do is to give sleep deprivation or insomnia function. Because at that point, again, I mentioned brains like patterns. If you wake up and you decide, oh, I'm awake, I might as well pop downstairs and make a cup of tea, have a biscuit, something along those lines. Well, your brain recognizes at 3 a.m. it's tea and biscuit time. And
Yeah.
it genuinely works that way, unfortunately.
So I think I read that it was like the amount of people that wake up nightly, and I think this was still only like the UK or Britain, was 40%. And that is a wild amount of people. Like,
Mhm.
and especially I think if you look at the bigger picture, because obviously that statistic was England. Like, if we look at the bigger picture, we move towards like, the States, Australia, and other parts of the world. Like, this issue just escalates and gets bigger. This isn't just a English problem. This is like a worldwide issue.
Absolutely. Even where you are, there will be some problems. And it's really a case of the numbers that we see in Britain are ever so slightly elevated above kind of the global norm when we start looking at prevalence of sleep disorders. But sleep disorders, even as a general, or sleep complaints, if you like, we think that there's about 2 billion worldwide. And to put that into context, more people have a sleep problem than have an iPhone.
Oh, see, I would have correlated in my head that the more that iPhones came about, then there would have been sleep problems. However, being the other way around is wild. But also, that's also like quarter of the population.
Absolutely. Yeah,
God,
absolutely.
it's just insane numbers, and it's one thing that I think people just don't realize is an issue, because I didn't. Like, I knew people have like sleepless nights, but
Mhm.
2 billion people is such a huge amount of people.
absolutely. And again, you're right. Most people will go through, and it's a weird world of sleep, to be honest with you. It almost doesn't become a problem until the person thinks it's a problem. So lots of people can go undiagnosed for many, many years and be treated for some of the symptoms that they see of it. So we're talking high blood pressure, for instance, as I say, mentioned, stroke, cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, those sorts of things. They end up with lots of medications, but the underlying problem has never really been discussed. And
Yeah, the
often
root
that
cause
can be
is
sleep.
still there.
Yeah.
That's something I discuss a lot, especially in nutrition, is the fact that people will lose weight or try to become healthier, and like once they've kind of got to that, it's very much, hey, everything kind of is gained back, because the root of the problem that it wasn't the solution. Like the solution was losing it, but if that wasn't fixed, like it's always gonna come back at some point. If we do look at the other end of the spectrum, though, because obviously,
Mhm.
as you said, two billion people are, you know, are do have sleep problems. But how many people are sleeping well? Because that's it. That's still a good, 6 million people. If we can correlate that to 2 billion people not sleeping well, is the other 6 billion sleeping well, or is this just skewed numbers?
So and I say this is where it comes in again that if they think they're sleeping well, in theory, you are. Because if you're waking up, you feel refreshed, you don't see any mal effects during the day, there's no obvious, detriment to your overall well-being at that point, be it physical or psychological, then in theory, yeah, you're meeting your sleep requirement. And it's no use me going into someone that's sleeping 8 hours and going, oh, in actual fact, you need 8.5. It's almost being a bit too puritanical about it at that point. So as long as somebody feels that their sleep is of adequate quality, they're waking up in the morning not feeling essentially hungover, if you like, um, then yeah, most people that feel that way should or very likely are meeting their sleep requirement.
So, what is causing people to have bad sleep? Because like for it to be such a big issue, and is it because there is a prevalence of phones, or is it noise pollution or light pollution, or devices around the house, things in the bedroom? But at the same time, like this is also in countries that don't have a lot of these things as well. As you just
Mhm.
mentioned, me being in Bali, that there's issues still over here, but these people also don't have the luxuries that people in the Western world do. So what? Yeah, is there kind of
So
there's something causing this.
it could be all of them and none of them is the general answer. I know that's probably not the answer that most people want to hear.
Mm.
But essentially, yes, those things can very much have an impact. So one of the things, or I'm hesitant to call it a myth because it's not, but people talk about blue light and screens and things like that. And yes, it does have an impact, for instance, slightly on your melatonin production, which is your darkness hormone, if you like. But the thing that's keeping you awake with these bits of tech, be that a phone, a TV, or otherwise, is actually the action. It's that waking action of doom scrolling, of playing on an Xbox or something along those lines. And again, it comes down to patterns. Brain goes, this is a waking action. I need to increase your waking hormones so that we can stay this way. Um, and so all of a sudden, people decide that they're going to turn the TV off, instantly fall asleep. And okay, they might, because they're sleep deprived already from many, many weeks and months and years of sleep deprivation. But as they fall asleep, their sleep quality itself isn't as good. They're not going to go through that architecture of sleep in the way that we would otherwise like to see.
Because I was going to mention blue light, but as you said, it's kind of, is it the blue light, or is it the fact that you're scrolling on TikTok for 3 hours? I think
Scrolling.
it's very
Yeah.
much it's the causation there. It's very much, is it what you're actually doing? Are you being addicted? Are you getting sucked into like watching 30-second reels over and over and over again? And like sometimes you think it's only four of them, that you've actually watched 55 and 2 hours have passed.
Yeah.
It's very much that. And I like, obviously there's a lot out there that talk about blue light, but it's very much how much is too much if like you are being addicted to a device that's keeping you in front of it.
Yeah, and it's exactly that. And for me personally, this is one of the things that certainly I try to practice what I preach when I do this sort of thing. I have no TV in our bedroom. There is a charger that my phone goes on so that it's actually not under the pillow. I can't just reach behind and get it for me. Um, because I'm human. I may well do if I hear a ping. Most people will. So it goes on do not disturb. It goes on a charger. My wife next to me does the same. And so it's about limiting those things and making your bedroom a haven for sleep, essentially. It should almost be that as you walk into the bedroom, your brain recognizes, we're in that room that either we sleep or we have sex. Those are the two options it's got. And if you're not initiating the second one of the two, it instantly knows the only other option is sleep. So it starts to do everything it should do. But if you start introducing lots of other things in that room, all of a sudden the decision it's got can go in multiple different ways.
So realistically, you need to kind of have a space that's free from any other kind of distraction. So you don't really want your
Mhm.
bedroom as a workspace because you can kind of have work and bed at the same time, and you don't want to be having that as like a watching room as your TV and whatever fill in blank. I guess you kind of want it to be free from as much as physically possible
Exactly.
from things that can distract you from sleeping.
Yeah, very much so. So, and again, it's important to understand that obviously there are some people out there that will live in a studio flat, for instance, and that becomes very, very difficult because their eating, their working, their living space might also be their bedroom. So it's about ensuring that the spaces that you work with, even in that context, you're able to differentiate. So it might be, for instance, that whilst you're working and you might be next to your bed, for instance, like I am right now in a hotel room, that it is a very separate thing. And so that you're sat at a table, you're not sitting on your bed doing your work. So that it feels very different when you get into there and it understands, okay, that's the sleep area, if you like.
When it comes to having kids, it's a
Mhm.
big issue for a lot of people because people that do prioritize their sleep no longer cannot prioritize their sleep because there's a baby, a child, a toddler, even teenagers, um, you know, waking you up at all times of the night, especially newborns. It's a very stressful period where you're trying to look after this other human, and it's kind of a lot of the time unavoidable to kind of be be fast asleep consistently for the first like I'd say year, it's 2 years maybe.
Yeah, and it's important to note at this point, you you have almost a subset speciality within sleep where people will do sleep training, particularly for babies and young children, and that's certainly not my area of expertise, so I won't speak too much on it. But essentially, yes, it is going to be a disruption, and there's a little bit of research out there. There's not huge amounts that looks at, for instance, a woman's sleep cycling as they go through and as they get closer and closer towards delivery, at that point, their sleep architecture almost changes ever so slightly. We think it might be adapted to listening out, for instance, for the particular tone of a baby's cry. They're more likely to rouse from sleep and be able to help. So it can feel occasionally like an inevitability. Um, it's important, though, that where possible, if you do have, and you're lucky enough to be in a partnership there, that somebody has the opportunity to try and grab sleep where they can. I'm very pro nap in the right context, for instance. As long as you're napping and it doesn't impact you being able to fall asleep later on that night, absolutely, please do. And let your partner, take the baby, as I say, if you're lucky enough to be in that situation for 2 hours so that you can get your sleep. It's about working together on that one.
I was actually going to ask about napping because it's one of those things that I think is very hit and miss with the person. It's everybody's very bio individual, especially in places where there's a hot country. Say Esther works for people, but I'm guessing that's very much due down to the heat. Whereas napping for me personally, if I nap at like 12, 1 o'clock, I'm not sleeping at night. Like I am sleeping, but it's
Yeah.
going to take me a bit further. It's a lot longer to get into like that pattern of being like, I need to get down and sleep, and maybe a bit of tossing and turning, and eventually I will. But for some people, I know a nap will actually just ruin their whole entire night.
Yeah, absolutely. It's essentially because there's two systems in the body when we start talking about sleep. You've got your circadian rhythm that people might be aware of. So that's kind of a natural hormonal changes through the day. And you've got a kind of a super clock that sits in right behind, sort of behind the eyes, and called your suprachiasmatic nucleus. And so that's controlling that side of things. And then the second part to that is called sleep pressure or sleep drive. And essentially, the longer you are awake, the higher that pressure gets. So if halfway through the day, you've decided, I'm going to have a 2 hour nap, a siesta, you've massively reduced that drive at that point. You've taken a chunk away. So by the time you get to an evening, okay, all your hormones are telling you it's time to sleep, but there might not be enough of a sleep drive just to push you over that little sleep cliff, if you like. So it can be a bit more of a struggle at that point.
For someone that may enjoy a nap, but it may disrupt their sleep later on, is there like an optimal time for a nap? Because I've seen in the past people being like, oh, 28 minutes, power nap, and that's like
Yeah.
the optimal version of a nap. Whereas obviously 2 hours, it could be considered too long for a nap. But is there an optimal time where it's not really going to be too disruptive to the system, or is that very much once again by individual basis and depends on the people?
Yeah, it is slightly individual, don't get me wrong. But typically speaking, yeah, you're not a million miles away. Bit of research recently says around about 12 to 15 minutes. That's kind of your optimal time because you're not going to have at that point had a nice little dive into those deeper stages where all of a sudden it becomes very difficult to wake you up. You'll wake up at that point feeling very, very groggy if you let it go on too long, and you almost lose the point of doing what you did the nap for, which is to feel a bit more invigorated again.
Hmm. I do feel like for 12 to 15 minutes, is it even worth it?
As I say, for some people though, it can be, and if you do it properly, as I say, ideally a nap, you want to be in the environment for it. I don't want to do it here, sat upright. It needs to be ideally there's an area for it. I go and have a nap, and there's different ways of doing it. You can set a little beep alarm that goes off, or you may well have seen this in the past. People might hold something and then as they're just drifting and they lose their muscle tone, that's roughly about right. They drop it, it hits the floor, wakes them up. There's different ways you can go about it. But yeah, certainly for some people, they'll feel no benefit to that whatsoever. But there does appear to be some slight improvement with cognitive function post mini nap, if you like.
Hmm. So for someone that is struggling with sleep patterns, sleep routine, and maybe looking to become more beneficial with sleep without having to rely on things like tablets or medicating themselves and just kind of hoping for the best, is there a routine that you've created that cultivates the best sleep for yourself that maybe people can kind of take notes from? As you said, obviously you said the device in the corner of the room, and but is there other versions like sleep patterns for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, for me, people can take notes, of course. It might not suit them at all. And as we've all got our slightly individual times that we may well need to fall asleep. But certainly, when you think of sleep, people think of it as just a nighttime activity. It's almost a 24-hour activity. It's the things you're doing in the day as well that make a big, big difference. And it starts with the point you wake up in a perfect world, and it's something I certainly try to do, I'll go for a walk. You want exposure to daylight almost the time that you wake up, because that is something that we refer to as a Zeitgeber or a time giver. It resets that clock that I mentioned, your natural rhythm, so that by the time you're getting towards nighttime, you have been perfectly set for that day. So yeah, I'll wake up in the morning. I go for about a 45-minute walk. Arguably, that's because I'm going to work. So for some people that might not work. They might want to just sit in front of a window, for instance. It doesn't have to be a bright sunny day. We don't get much of that in the UK. It can be clouds. That's fine. It'll still do the job. And then as you move through the day, certainly, obviously, from your perspective as well, what you eat is going to make a difference and the times that you eat. the amount of physical activity that you're doing, because that will increase your sleep drive overall. And then certainly as you get towards that bedtime that you've set yourself, yeah, from my perspective, I will do things like about half an hour before I want to sleep. I will do really boring but very strict tasks. So TV off, I'm not answering my phone anymore, but I will go and let my dog out because I still need to go out and do a wee, come back in, I'll wash up. And all the while, this isn't with bright lights on. So my hormones are starting to increase, my melatonin, my brain is getting the cues that these are the tasks that I do before bed. And so by the time I enter my bedroom and it understands that that's the room for sleep, yeah, I'm usually pretty set.
So you've basically just created this pattern in your head, because
Yeah.
obviously the brain does love patterns.
hmm
And knowing that that's going to be this, and then it's kind of setting yourself up for the best night's sleep possible. But is it beneficial for somebody to kind of try to implement a actual bedtime as well, and also a waking up time? Because that could be for somebody anytime. It's kind of like, hey, this could be 10 o'clock, but it could also be 1 in the morning. And then let's say the wake up time is exactly the same each time, or further on during the day. Like, having a pattern that actually implements specific bedtimes, would that be more beneficial?
Absolutely. As I say, and we've said it God knows how many times. I hope people have taken it away. Patterns is everything, if you like. But certainly a fixed wake up time is normally more useful than a fixed bedtime. As I say, because of that reset point, if you like. So having a fixed wake up time, even at weekends, no sleeping in, which I know for some people will be a real challenge. Get yourself up, and then, yeah, usually a set bedtime, because at least that way you're looking at giving yourself an appropriate opportunity for sleep. And okay, you might not sleep throughout that. Again, I think it's important that we don't overamp someone closing their eyes, wake up in the morning, and that happens 100% all the time. It just won't. But certainly, if you give yourself adequate opportunity with a fixed bedtime and a fixed wake up time, you're standing yourself in good stead.
Caffeine. Caffeine is a big one. Myself, if I drink caffeine after 1, it disrupts me. One of my very close friends can drink black coffee at 12 at night and fall asleep.
Mhm.
He's a psychopath. I don't know how it happens, but caffeine, it's it's a stimulant. It's waking people up. That's what it's there for a lot of people. However, specific times of the day, in the morning, great. In the afternoon, can really disrupt people's patterns. But how does caffeine play a role in sleep? Because there's so
Yeah,
much going on about it, and people talk about it so much.
so essentially it's blocking channels. Caffeine is acting as a bodyguard, if you like, to the sleep drive that I mentioned. So it's saying, no, 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 you can't come in here. And what the problem that you occasionally find for some people is that, yes, they will have a coffee far, far, far too late. So the half-life is about 4 hours. So even if you've had a coffee 8 hours prior, you've still got a quarter of a cup swimming about. And so there'll still be some of those bodyguards there in your brain saying, no, 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 you can't come in. Um, Problem, of course, is that at certain points, you can't take on anymore. It's actually, for most people, it's more the habit of the warm drink. So for a majority of people, I will say, look, as best you can, around lunchtime, past that point, no more caffeinated beverages. A warm drink, absolutely fine. Go and grab yourself a decaf one, because for most people, again, it's that. Most people aren't necessarily needing caffeine at 7 p.m. What are you trying to do? Um, Say it's the warm drink, teas, even green teas, of course, people have this perception there's nothing, no caffeine in those. It's important to understand that there is. So yeah, warm drinks, absolutely. Caffeine, I would steer clear after about lunchtime. There are certain people that will be less sensitive to it, be able to fall asleep, absolutely. But again, looking at what happens at the sleep afterwards, it has a slight impact on the architecture of sleep.
I think that's such an important thing as well, which you mentioned, people not assuming things like green tea don't have caffeine. And I was under the impression that for a long time,
Yeah.
that these things don't, or like a peppermint tea or
Mhm.
whatever the choice of kind of like herbal tea is, that a lot of these do still have, even if it's a slight tad, like they still have caffeine in them, and that could be ruining your night's sleep. If you're going to sleep and it's very much there's a bit of disruption, it may be due to this, green tea that you didn't really think much is going on in there.
Yeah, it's exactly that. And that's more of an awareness campaign element, if you like, and more the PR side of things. Which, as I say, the company that I work for, ResMed, they are doing their best on that side of things at the moment, because we know there are these people out there that are doing all of these things that have an impact on their sleep, but they just don't know, and it's not really their fault. It's just that education around sleep hasn't been the same as it has been for fitness and nutrition for a little while now.
Mentioning fitness,
Yeah.
fitness is very prevalent in today's society, more than it ever has been. But people do tend to exercise either in the morning or the afternoon / evening, depending on work schedules, I guess. And exercise before bed. Like for me, I go for a run late night. I will not sleep. However,
Yeah.
if I go to the gym before bed, I would just fall asleep straight away. And I don't know is it the release of adrenaline that's kind of like keeping you awake, or that dopamine hit? Because like running, if you're doing a long distance, obviously that's waking your brain up a lot more than you maybe pushing a few weights.
It's a mix. To be quite honest with you, yeah, there will certainly be certain stress hormones, of course, that get released. You mentioned adrenaline there as well, and yes, they will have an impact. But what we tend to think is it's more to do with your internal body temperature. So as we are moving towards sleep, we naturally see a drop in our core body temperature, and it gets lower and lower and lower and lower till around about 2, 3 a.m. in the morning on average for most people, where you are in really quite deep sleep at that point. So by counteracting that, by doing a lot of physical activity before bed, you raise your internal body temperature, and it's sending the wrong cues. So again, it's all about cues, and temperature is certainly one of them. But again, there's always nuance to this. Being healthy and being able to be active is vitally important. So am I going to sit there and go, no, 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 you can't do your evening run anymore. You're not allowed to go to the gym. Absolutely not. Of course I'm not. Um, but it's just about people understanding where that interaction is between physical activity and what it will do to sleep. So for most people, if you are going to exercise, and I would hope most people do this anyway, but something like a warm shower after doing that, and then getting out, not too hot, by the way, just a warm shower, means that it all evaporates and it acts as like a heat dump, takes away some of that surface heat, drops that body temperature back down a little bit, and that can sometimes elicit good sleep.
And if somebody was to do a cold shower, which is also another thing that is trending at the moment, cold showers,
Yes,
especially in the morning. Well, in the morning it's not really going to affect your sleep. But if that's something that you're doing
it's
in the evening, I'm guessing there's issues.
essentially you're doing the opposite. Everything constricts, so your core body temperature is doing its best to stay warm at that point. It wants to. So in actual fact, something like a cold dip or a cold shower, it's usually not ideal. You'll see some level of impact, not necessarily again on getting to sleep because you will feel nice and cool. Um, but it's what happens afterwards in terms of, as I say, how we move through those stages.
If we flip the switch
Yep.
and we look at the statistics that you guys have, and it was whether the 36% of people are watching TV in the evening, or it was the 70% of people checking their work emails, or 23% reading the news, and 42% scrolling through social media.
Mhm.
If somebody's scrolling through TikTok and Reels, or they're checking their emails and they're getting that somewhat dopamine hit from that, which is great. You're getting your dopamine hit, but what is that really doing to our body? Like lack of sleep deprivation, like what's that actually doing to our health? Because I think a lot of people think, oh, like, yeah, like lack of sleep isn't going to do anything. I'm just going to be a bit more tired over time. However, there's more things at play. It isn't just lack of sleep. There's so many other things going on within the body.
Absolutely. And it's, again, it's really going to be multifaceted when you start looking at this. But if you look at the generations that are very much attached to their devices and their TikTok, we're talking, the millennial, Gen Z, etc. Well, if you start to look at some of the breakdown of why people feel they're struggling to sleep, the people that are scoring highest in things like stress, anxiety, the more mental health side of things, well, guess what? They are your millennials, your Gen Zers, things like that. And it's when you move down perhaps into different age groups, you start finding things like financial issues and concerns, and geopoliticism, of course. There's always going to be elements of that that play on people's minds. But yeah, there is a very likely, as we always say in this field, correlation isn't causation, but you can look at quite a lot of these correlations occurring over time. It's just about then looking at, is it chicken or egg? Is poor sleep leading to anxiety and stress, etc.? Because we know there's a link there. Is anxiety and stress leading to poor sleep? Because we know that there's a link there. And the truth be told, it's probably a vicious cycle.
Anxiety and obviously depression being a big thing, but there's links to chronic disease as well, isn't there? It's not just those two are bad enough without having chronic disease issues if you have lack of sleep over time.
Absolutely. And again, it is almost like a dartboard where you can put any condition you like up there, throw your dart of sleep, and you'll hit something that will have an impact on. One of the big ones at the moment, the big talking points, of course, is things like Alzheimer's. And essentially, reason for that is that through the day, we end up with these little plaques build up in the brain, called beta amyloids. And then normally what would happen is as we dive out again, it's a nice deep sleep, is where some of the real fantastic stuff happens. Blood flow dissipates from the brain and spinal fluid comes in. And it acts as a bit of a wash for the brain, if you like. Takes away some of those plaques, gets rid of them, you're reset, ready for the next day. Well, people not necessarily getting deep sleep aren't having that wash. And those little plaques build up more and more over time, and we're seeing that they are having a huge increased risk to people developing Alzheimer's about 10 years their senior. So it really is having quite a significant impact earlier on in people's lives.
That is actually fascinating because I think a lot of people think of Alzheimer's as just this thing that happens. But
Mhm.
I think from a sleep standpoint, even a nutrition standpoint, there is different leading causes towards some of these illnesses. And much like sleep, you got your diabetes and your
Mhm.
cardiovascular diseases and mental health disorders, and as well as like even people that are more athletic having your lack of sleep when you are very athletic, those inflammatory markers also are going up. It's not something that's just going down because you've had lack of sleep. Those things are always going to play a big role in your body, whether that is nutrition, whether that is sleep, whether that's whatever kind of health exercise someone's going through.
Mhm. Yeah, and the thing is, and you've brought it out quite nicely there, is that it doesn't pick and choose. You can be, as you mentioned there, an elite athlete. You can have the best nutrition in the world. You get an army of nutritionists working for you, making sure that every bit of micro and macronutrition is perfect. But it doesn't mean that you're going to sleep well. And quite often we do find, even in those cohorts of patients, that they don't. And part and parcel of that, yes, maybe the physical elements to it, but again, it comes back a lot to the psychological.
Yeah, as well. I think as well. Like I think everybody has their own set of circumstances as well on why they may they may not be able to sleep. Whether that, especially for athletes, like high performing athletes, is am I going to do well? Am I now going to be stressing about this? As well, like as some people do have financial issues and worries about certain other bits. Like there's so many different things at play there.
Yeah, it's so for one that I really like to use is I think he's still on it to be honest, Shaquille O'Neal, which I'm sure many people will be familiar with, the giant that he is. Um, for instance, elite athlete. Don't get me wrong, he's probably carrying a few extra pounds these days, but elite athlete at the time, he has, for instance, got obstructive sleep apnea. Um, it's not anything necessarily he was doing. It's very likely that there is a component in his upper airway that is the problem. And throughout the night, his airway just closes off. And as I mentioned, no air in, no air out. Your brain is going to say, we could probably do you with waking you out of this nice restorative stuff, and because you're not breathing particularly well. And for a lot of people, particularly if they're severe, that is happening once every 2 minutes. If I set an alarm on your bedside table that went off once every 2 minutes, it wouldn't be very long before you're quite upset with me. And essentially, that is what the brain is doing. It's just that most people will never remember that's happening. They won't be aware. So usually it's the partner next to them that has informed them, and it's quite anxious themselves. I saw you stop breathing for 45 seconds the other night. And all of a sudden, yep, we start seeing an influx of those. So elite athlete, doesn't matter.
We mentioned sleep apnea a few times during this, and
Yeah.
for people that don't understand what sleep apnea is, and I think there was also a very scary statistic that I think also came from ResMed, which was that 80% of people are undiagnosed with sleep
Correct.
apnea. That's a huge. Is that just in Britain?
No, that's worldwide.
That's what that's an
Luck,
insane amount of an
yeah,
insane amount of people.
yeah, luckily enough, that is worldwide. Yeah, it's 80% worldwide, but again, the overall total that we were looking at is just shy of about 1 billion. We're being reasonably conservative with that estimate as well. Not just ResMed. This is across the board for most people. The numbers all come out the same. Um, and yeah, it can be, as I say, it's these pauses in breathing. The things that people need to look out for, really, is firstly snoring. It's usually one of the big telltale signs for a lot of people, that real mouth open, raspy snore. You've then got things like, again, we kind of mentioned this, waking up not feeling refreshed, like you've actually slept, even though you've given yourself 8 or 9 hours. It might be that when you're watching TV late of a night or reading a book, whatever you're doing, you find yourself just falling and you can't stop yourself. It might be popping to the loo. There are so many symptoms that point in that direction, but we've got the task, and as I say, it's something that ResMed are attempting to do, of directing people towards that and making sure that they understand, look, this is an element that's going on here that might be a symptom of obstructive sleep apnea. And something you may well see it actually. They've just brought out a new little campaign called the Sleep Monster campaign. And all it is to show that there is this thing that people are living with that other people can't see because you never would, but it just disrupts your day in every single way possible, and in ways that you wouldn't even necessarily think. It's not malevolent, it can be a case of falling asleep at your desk, something along those lines, but it's not something you have to live with forever. And that's where things like CPAP start to come in, which I'm sure you'd then ask for that, but CPAP, in essence, is continuous positive airway pressure or air scaffolding for your airways, if you like. It's just a small amount of airflow that comes through a mask, and it just provides a bridge for your airway so that you can breathe as you are in the day, essentially.
You mentioned the breathing scaffolding, and I
Mhm.
one of my best friends does have a sleep apnea mask. Unfortunately,
Great.
um,
No, not unfortunately. Good, good.
oh, I mean, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
unfortunately sleep apnea,
Yes.
but luckily has the mask.
Yeah.
But I feel like, yeah, that's one of those things that's very disruptive to someone's life, is having to put a mask on at night, and very much just kind of have to sleep through that, getting the right airflow going through, and having a tank next to your bed. It's not the most convenient thing. However, it serves a purpose.
And it's getting far more convenient. So if you look now, for instance, at the AirSense 11, people used to think you had to wheel these things on trolleys. You don't anymore. It's just this little box that sits on your bedside table. Has a humidifier for you, so it's not dry air. And it's the problem that sometimes people have is they think of it being this huge, big problem of wearing a mask. I'm going to look like a fighter pilot or Bane or something along those lines. I'm going to struggle to wear this. Perfectly legitimate concerns. But that doesn't tend to always be the case. Masks these days have come such a long way. They're using very soft silicons now. You can have just nasal masks. So it doesn't need to be this scary thing that a lot of people seem to think about it, which, okay, in the past, yes, may well have been. Nowadays, it's almost like just a consumer product that sits on your bedside table, as big as an alarm clock. So yeah, certainly, I'm pleased that he's got the therapy, but certainly if it's something that he's struggling with, for instance, that he doesn't quite like the mask that he's got and he struggles to or feels a bit claustrophobic, stand under the mask. You don't have to stay with the mask that you're given, and there's plenty of options out there.
Yeah, I think the issue that I heard, I think from his girlfriend, was the fact he sounded like Darth Vader, and that is.
Uh, yeah, that's the common one. So it's either Darth Vader or really loud snoring, and for most people, we'll take a little bit of Darth Vader. But certainly, again, these days, the motors are a lot more quiet. I say the masks themselves, the only time they really make noise is if they've got a leak, so you're not fitting the mask correctly. It's so finding a mask that you're comfortable wearing, regardless, is the big point. One that you can get a good seal on, if I can speak correctly. That point, therapy, in terms of the outcome, almost follows suit because you're happy to wear it, it's staying on your face, and it should be providing the therapy that you need. So yeah, certainly if he's got some issues with the mask, tell him to go have a little bit of a look at what's out there. There's way more.
Absolutely. And I think, is there a correlation with sleep apnea and people who are slightly overweight and have obesity issues?
Nicely phrased. It's a slightly common misconception that it's an overweight person's problem. Okay, being obese, being overweight is always going to increase that risk because the minute you add extra weight around the airways, you're going to be causing a bit of a problem in terms of keeping them open. As we fall asleep, we lose all that nice muscle tone. Any additional weight is going to collapse the airway. But weight tends to be more of an exacerbating factor for a lot of people. And so, yes, it's an element. It's not usually the sole reason. People can lose a lot of weight, as I say, have a great overall well-being, exercise, brilliant nutrition, but they've still got obstructive sleep apnea. You could be underweight with obstructive sleep apnea. Um, the problem that people find, and it'll be in your walk of life as well, is that as we sleep, nice little balance of hormones goes on. Two in particular would focus on with nutrition would be ghrelin, the one that makes you feel hungry, and leptin, the one that makes you feel full. Well, ghrelin takes a rocket upwards when we get poor sleep, and leptin takes a plummet. So we are more hungry, very rarely full. So what do we go and eat? Usually more carbohydrates because they're going to be calorie dense. And so most people on average with obstructive sleep apnea, untreated anyway, will consume about extra 300 calories a day. Adds
That
up.
is, yeah, I was about to say that adds up over the space of a week or a month or a year. That adds
Mhm.
up significantly. But
Yeah.
yeah, I've never really thought about that in my own practice. Of obviously people with those certain conditions having to eat more, or just feeling that they need to eat certain things, in comparison to what somebody that doesn't have that would be able to actually just kind of take in without having that feeling.
Yeah. Yeah, and as I say, this is where an understanding of the amount of impacts that sleep can have will also improve areas of nutrition and fitness. Because it's about understanding that, okay, I've given all of these people this information, but they're fighting a bit of an uphill battle, really. It's more difficult for those people because all of their hormones are screaming at them, please consume more food. They don't need to, but they're being asked to.
One particular issue has been coming up more and more recently. I think that mainly because there's a lot more science around it, and there's a few episodes coming out about this coming soon as well, and that is menopause and
Mm.
perimenopause. Um, I feel like once again a very overlooked subject for the last few years, and I think especially
Yeah,
in the
and
last,
the
I'd say,
rest.
yeah, exactly
Yeah.
that. I think in the last, I'd say 4 years especially, it's become more at the forefront of especially nutrition science. Um, but menopause and perimenopause takes a big role in your everyday life, especially sleep, but like let alone just being awake on a day-to-day basis. Um, 'Cause obviously there's, I think the statistics that I got as well were 73% obviously experience disturbed sleep, 62% report lower sleep quality, 63% have night sweats and hot flushes, 53% suffer from joint and pain at night,
Mhm.
52% wake up frequently just to use the bathroom, and also 15% have sleep apnea as well.
Yep. Um, and to say again, right in what you say, women's health in general, until slightly more recently, has pretty much been overlooked. All of the research is typically on men and people that look like you and I, again, typically speaking. Um, so it's starting to improve. Now, when we start talking about women's cycles and particularly, as I say, perimenopause, it's essentially, again, it's to do with those hormone balances, estrogen and progesterone. And for those women listening, no, I am not about to try and mansplain all of that. It is a case of most people know that they are reproductive hormones generally, but they have an impact on sleep. So estrogen, for instance, will have an impact on things like serotonin receptors. And that is one of the things that helps you have a nice continuous maintenance of sleep. And progesterone actually helps guide you into sleep. It has almost a sedative property. So even for women during their different stages of their cycle, will find that they will sleep better at certain points than others. So by the time you get to perimenopause, when we see a plummet of both of those hormones, all of a sudden we haven't got this sedative effect. We haven't got this protective effect over the sleep. What we've got is this constant, and you mentioned it there, constant wakings, and they're wondering why. They're hot, of course. And there has been a little bit of research, and it's something that certainly I can't prescribe. I'm not a doctor. I think it's important to say that. Um, HRT, and it's a hot topic for a lot of people. So I'm not going to give too much of an opinion about it, but it has been shown that it can improve sleep because it's improving those hormone balances as well. And certainly, you mentioned at the end there, again, obstructive sleep apnea. Both of those hormones have typically a protective effect over the upper airway. So, crikey, yeah, they're being hit from all directions.
Yeah, I feel like we did get the better angle being guys. We
Oh,
don't
yeah.
have, we don't have so
Yeah.
many of these issues that we have, monthly cycles or perimenopause, menopause, everything else. We did get it easy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. I'm quite thankful for it.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
I think it's always, yeah, important for us to understand that, yeah, it's quite a privileged position. And it's important to understand that just because we don't really have those cycles, it doesn't mean that the person next to us, their sleep works in the same way. The person next to us typically being a woman. So, yeah, it's important just to understand that sleep is going to vary for those people.
With with perimenopause and menopause, this isn't something like induced by a phone, like some people,
No.
where literally you can just kind of, hey, we can stop watching TikTok for 5 minutes and we might actually be able to get to sleep. This is just the body changing. So how does somebody who is going through either one of these situations at least help to alleviate some of the symptoms and get a better night's sleep?
Don't get me wrong, it's a difficult one. As I say, this is another uphill battle, really. And yes, of course, always speak to your doctor, your primary physician, see if there's an option there that can help you. Um, but in terms of the structure side of things, again, following a typical routine is usually a good pattern to go by regardless, particularly for eliciting sleep. But then we start talking about things like when we're talking about body temperature, hot flushes, things like that. There are little things that you can put in place. So it might be, for instance, and I'm a big fan of this, regardless of whether or not you're perimenopausal, woman or man, is to have your own duvet. They do it typically across the pond a few different ways, but having your own duvet with its own tog rating, its own cover if you want it to be, so that you've got something perhaps a little bit more breathable than the person that's laying next to you under a 13.5 tog, absolutely roasting. It means you're not sharing that same body heat as well. And so it's things like that, and it's not an expensive way of doing it, and it can almost provide you your own little zone in the bed. But what I know is important for a lot of people as well is that kind of that contact with their partner next to them. So it's not taking that away. It's just giving you that individuality of sleep back again.
I think people do forget about that, is the fact that you are sleeping in bed with a partner a lot of the
Mhm.
time. And if you just have a duvet that's being used by both of you and you have different preferences and it doesn't work for either of you, that's going to be quite disruptive to your life, your sleeping patterns, and many other things throughout the day.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's a movement, and you may well have seen it in the survey itself as well, for something referred to as a sleep divorce. Now, I don't particularly like that language because people have negative connotations over it. It doesn't have to be like that. Again, sleep individualism, if you like, kind of taking back your own sleep, sleeping in either separate beds in the same room or sleeping in different rooms, because we do tend to sleep better when we don't have somebody else affecting our sleep, whether that's through movement, body heat, snoring, you name it. So there is a little bit of a movement coming. It tends not to be the case so much in the UK, but again, if you look in some other countries, it is quite a big thing. Like in Japan, for instance, they'll typically have separate beds.
I have seen this, and I actually really like the idea because
Yeah.
I think I've always come at the idea of like you've chosen to be with somebody. However, at the same time, you're now choosing to sleep in the same bed and maybe be uncomfortable for the majority of your life,
Yeah.
but you spend so much of your time sleeping. So having the idea of like maybe a spare bed for when like you do need that time alone, or
Mhm.
maybe like having I've got a friend that sleeps in a yurt in the
Oh,
back
right.
garden,
Okay. Yeah.
which is that way of very much getting out the house, getting away, but still being able to be part of the household, but having
Mhm.
that but having that separation, which I actually quite enjoy when you do think that you may be spending the next of a life with this person, that
Exactly.
a lot of things aren't going to work in your favor or the other person's favor. You're just compromising on something that may not really need compromising on.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be, everyone always thinks whenever I talk about sort of separate beds or separate rooms that you're not allowed to get in bed with the other person. Of course you can. Go in there, do what you want to do, of course. But then when it comes time for either you to choose to sleep or your partner to choose to sleep, that's when you go to your other bed or your other room. And again, it almost again acts as a cue. Your brain recognizes, okay, I'm going to my own room now. It must be sleep time. And it allows you to work to your own natural rhythms, because we all seem to think that we're exactly the same as our partner. Oh, we both go to bed at X and Y time, or the majority do anyway. But really, our bodies don't tend to work like that. So it's more a case of, okay, well, if you want to sleep 20 minutes later, well, good news. You can. But it's just about, again, giving that kind of individualism back to sleep.
There's a lot of people that medicate to go to sleep, whether
Hmm.
that be medication, or whether that be natural remedies that they're either coming up with themselves, or going to a naturopath, or where do they kind of take a place when it actually comes to sleep? Because I feel like some things may not actually have science behind them, or some may, or you may be just medicating with a sleeping pill, but is that then addictive, and will that then lead you down a route of that's the only way I can sleep is taking this pill, and then you can't really move away from it?
Yeah. So again, important to say, if you're thinking about medication, supplementation, or otherwise, see your GP. This whatever I'm saying isn't a recommendation. It's just what I know in terms of the research that's out there is that essentially sleep medications. So people tend to talk about the Z drugs, and so hypnotics and things like that. They are short-term fixes for a lot of people, and they have a place. Um, Problem being, of course, is that for some people it becomes a crutch, and they use that on a far too regular a basis, and then it becomes a hell of a problem falling to sleep without them. So you actually end up causing more of a problem than you're solving a lot of the time. When you're talking about supplementations and the such like, okay, yes, there is some loose research out there, and it looks at the ways that certain pathways work in the brain. So, as just as an example, magnesium will have a certain effect on the GABA receptors in the brain. But again, consuming the right type of magnesium, the right amounts, it's all very, very individual. And for most people, they'll be consuming it at the wrong time, too much or too little. And again, for the most part, if we have a reasonable nutrition, not even a great nutrition, you probably will be consuming enough. And supplementation beyond that point usually isn't necessary. But certainly, if you're thinking about it, yeah, visit your GP just to have that discussion.
Yeah, because I remember when I first started training in nutrition, there was a mention around people going to getting to sleep by drinking tart cherry juice, and
Yeah.
I've never once after hearing that, I've never tried it myself, but didn't know there was actually any relevance to that in any way, shape, or form. Or if it's one of those kind of it could work, might do. It's got some melatonin, but not enough to kind of push through and put someone to sleep.
Yeah, it's the amount of melatonin that you would benefit from that. Same with things like walnuts as well, in terms of how it ends up in the body and the amount you get. The likely change that you'll see isn't so vast that all of a sudden it's becoming hypnotic. That's not what melatonin is, but it's what people think it is. They think, oh, if I have all of this, it's going to make me, fall asleep, and it doesn't. All it is, again, melatonin is the darkness hormone. It only occurs typically when it gets dark, and it's almost like your little nudge. Again, you're already standing on the cliff. It's that little nudge into the world of sleep. And you can do lots of things to disrupt that. Drinking just a bit of tart cherry or a handful of walnuts is unlikely to solve a bigger problem.
Yeah, I do feel like if you're going to have a cup of that but still scroll through TikTok, it's not really going to solve the issue.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And
It's not going
to
to
be
knock
quite
you
honest
out.
with you, yeah, often that unfortunately is the pathway that people take. They think it's kind of like a way of overcoming doing that, and it's not.
There was a completely new term for me that came up, which I feel like it's probably going to be quite new for a lot of people, which is sleep tourism.
Oh yeah. And that's like the world that you're in is probably a good example of this. But essentially, going abroad, typically to what might as well be something like a wellness center, and everything that you do there surrounds trying to get good sleep. You'll have, the blinds that go up automatically in the morning, give you lovely sunlight, all of these things. You've got a view of the mountains. You couldn't possibly be anxious. All of those things. The problem with it, whilst it's a wonderful idea for awareness, you can't bring much of that back with you. And so when you come back to your typical daily life, how much can you implement? So again, okay, lovely idea. I get the concept. But for me, it's not a long-term solution for a lot of people.
Yeah, it does also mean a lot of traveling as well if somebody wants to
Yeah,
continuously do that, which does
yeah.
get expensive. Because I was under the impression that people, the way I saw sleep tourism was, just moving from place to place. And I didn't know whether that's like, going 10 miles up the road, whether that's going to France or whether that's going all the way to Australia. And then in my head, I
Mhm.
was like, if you've gone all the way to Australia, is that just jet lag and you're just sleeping through it? I don't know. Um, but I didn't realize it was very much the wellness resorts. And as you said, yeah, especially where I am, those are everywhere. So I assume that's probably one of the bigger trends over here. Because everything is a wellness yoga retreat with, as you said, the lift up blinds that are just kind of opening you up to like a serene kind of
Yeah,
rice field, and that
which is
is what
lovely.
people are paying
Yeah,
for, which is yeah, which is
yeah,
beautiful. But like realistically, like if you're going from central London to that for 3 weeks and then going back to central London, you're still in central London. Like
absolutely.
you may be able to get some lift up blinds, but there's a big difference with especially noise pollution, light pollution, in regards to over here where there's not as much.
Yeah, and it's exactly that. And there's much cheaper options. It's called something like an eye mask.
Yeah.
Yeah, a few pounds for that one, and some earplugs, something along those lines. They're just, it's really cheap, but people think because it's cheap, it's not going to do the same job as spending, 4 or 5 thousand pounds going, to Hawaii to try and have this wonderful experience, which again, I'm sure is wonderful. But again, it's not going to change what happens when you come back home, and it's the things you do over that chronic period that have the big impact.
I think one thing that a lot of people do rely on, and I don't know how accurate they are, which is
Hmm.
watches for your sleep.
Thought that might be
Um,
coming.
and I, in the past, have used Google Watches and I've used Fitbits, and I didn't find them to be overly accurate. At the moment, I do have a device. I use a Whoop now, and I find that to be
Mhm.
very, very accurate. But I also don't know if this is from a nutrition standpoint. I find it accurate and exercise. When it comes to sleep, for me, it seems it because I'm like, oh, I got 96% sleep. I don't know if that's true. Um,
Yeah,
but how accurate are watches in this day and age, especially when like there's so much going on and there's so much that is not taking in from around you?
I think particularly for me, there is a place for them, and they are improving. Technology and wearable tech is hugely improving people's awareness and perceptions of certain conditions. Even Apple Watches and many others these days can even look for things like sleep apnea that I mentioned and screen for that. So 100% they have their place, but it's important that we remember at the moment anyway, they are quite a blunt tool. They are very, very good at looking at long-term patterns. So you can look at, okay, oh, this is my rough bedtime. I can see where I had some shorter periods of a sleep opportunity across these. And you're right, I did feel rubbish on those days. But when we start looking at, are these watches or any wearable able to discern, was my sleep staging appropriate? Was I diving into deep sleep in the right way? Is it giving me the results in an understandable manner? Because for most people, getting 20% deep sleep, is that good? Is that bad? Who knows? Um, Generally, that's about average, so that's pretty good. But yeah, they have their place, but at the moment, they're not the point of being perfectly accurate. Um, but they are, as I say, a reasonably good barometer for long-term patterns.
When you do look at those results, what is the difference between like the deep sleep, the REM sleep, the different versions of sleep? Because as you said, most people that don't have that knowledge don't really know the intricacies of what's what, and they're just kind of like, hey, I've got four different types of sleep. That's
Yeah,
great.
yeah, and for most people, they just go, "Oh, great, okay, that's what that means." But in essence, as we move through sleep, we've got non-REM sleep, which people might have heard of, but in actual fact, there's non-REM one, two, and three. And you can view that as your stairs downwards towards depths, if you like. NREM3 sleep is deep sleep, as people tend to call it. So that's your delta sleep or slow wave sleep. And REM sleep is almost, if you were looking at the brain patterns in comparison to being awake, and you just looked at those, they look remarkably similar. And we think it's one of the reasons why, particularly during REM, you get your slightly more vivid imagery when we talk about dreams. And as you go into REM sleep, for instance, you lose all muscle tone so that you're not murdering the person next to you in your sleep, which has happened on a few occasions. There's been a few legal cases, by the way.
Oh,
Oh yeah, we won't go too diving into those, but it usually, again, it's going to be very individual in terms of your percentages. For most wearables, it will note it as deep sleep, so that's your NREM3 amount, and REM sleep. It will kind of separate those, and it will call the rest either core sleep or something similar, because it's just everything else that's in there. And really, we spend a majority of our night in core sleep. But people think that, oh, just because I'm getting, let's say 12% deep or 15% REM, all that sounds really low, which it does. But in actual fact, that's quite normal. So it's just important for people to understand that I'm not expecting their night to look like 60 to 70% deep sleep. That would actually be quite weird. So yeah, on the slightly anywhere between 10 to 20% for sort of deep sleep and for REM is pretty much is spot on. Again, if you get a result that says something like 2% or 4% deep, you don't have to trust that. One of the big problems that I see coming through, particularly in our clinic as well, is that people say, I wake up feeling absolutely great, like no problem whatsoever, but my watch is telling me I'm rubbish. And at that point, they start believing the watch over how they feel. And that's where I say where that kind of orthosomnia comes in. So it's important that people don't let the watch dictate how they feel. You know how you feel.
before we round this off, there
Yeah.
was one topic that one of my friends brought up, which fascinates me, seeing that it's never happened to me, but sleep paralysis demons and other kind of things,
Yeah.
things like that, where people are, waking up seeing things. As you said earlier, people, thinking people are on fire next to them. All sorts going on in the room, what they're seeing, and why is that actually happening?
Um, it's still ongoing research, to be honest with you. But essentially what's happened there is we've gone probably into REM sleep, so we've lost all muscle tone, other than the ones basically just keeping us alive, breathing and heart pumping. And something might disturb you. It could be something external, it can be something internal, so like a respiratory disturbance. And you go through the gears wrong. Your brain wakes, eyes are open, you can move those, but you can't move anything else. Everything, all of your muscles remain with no tone. This is still asleep. And at that point, your brain essentially, we think, tries to understand, why can't I move? Um, and the really weird bit, and this, as I say, this is where things start getting interesting. People see very similar things. They refer to it as something like a homunculus, which is like a weird little monkey witch that sometimes sits on the chest. But it's reported in different walks of the world. Other people will have a sensation of someone being just out of eyeshot. There's just someone watching. And it can be quite disconcerting. It can feel really, really weird, particularly if you've never experienced it before. But the important thing is that as soon as you get control over even just a finger, your brain makes the connection and you'll wake up. But yeah, for most people, it's not going to cause a problem, but it can be quite anxiety inducing.
That makes a lot of sense than actually a little monkey person sitting on your chest.
Yeah.
But there's a few people, as you mentioned, that kind of that I've spoken to in the past that I've talked about like sleep paralysis demons, and they all kind of um, have the same kind of experience of the same kind of person,
Mm.
or there's something called the Hat Man, which
Yeah, oh yeah.
which was one. But I just found it fascinating for somebody that hasn't managed to ever experience anything like that. Like, not that I want to, because I feel like that's very, anxiety inducing for a lot of people. However, knowing that that's a thing that people seem to experience, and it's the same kind of concept each time, is fascinating to me.
Yeah, and as I say, it's probably a societal element to it there. The amount of TV that we've all watched in the past, we will tend to manifest something that looks like that. So that's where we think you start getting things that are similar across the world, rather than it being some sort of, otherworldly thing. It's more just the brain attempting to understand why you can't move, and it will put things there so that it goes, that might be why. But yeah, certainly it's not fun. I've had it myself. But it's, as I say, it's important to understand you will be fine. Nothing's going to happen there. Your body is still keeping you very much alive. It's just that you've gone through the gears wrong. That's all.
Amazing. Josh, it's been an absolute pleasure. Full of
Yeah, it's been
insight.
great.
For the people that want to know more about you or where to find you, where can people find you?
Best bet is through ResMed. So resmed.co.uk/better-sleep. You'll find me there, and you'll find ResMed's campaigns and the survey results that we've been talking about as well. But yeah, they can find me there.
Amazing. Josh, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm grateful for you.
I'm grateful for our chat as well. Great to talk to you.